You are sitting at a red light on the way to work, tapping the wheel, waiting for it to turn green like you have done 10,000 times before without a single conscious thought about it. It is easily the most boring 30 seconds of your entire day. You have never once considered it as something that could simply stop existing overnight, the same way you have never thought about the ground staying solid beneath your car. Then, at the exact same moment, it does. Every traffic light, every intersection, everywhere on the planet, all at once, without warning, without a countdown, without anyone announcing it. The instinct, at first, is to laugh it off a little. It is just a light, you think. People managed intersections for decades before automated signals ever existed anywhere. How complicated can one single intersection really be? But a traffic light was never really about red and green paint glowing on glass. It is a repeated silent promise that strangers moving toward each other at speed have quietly agreed, without ever exchanging a single word, on whose turn it actually is to go. Remove that promise, and nothing about the physical road changes at all except the one invisible thing that made sharing it survivable in the first place. There are roughly 300,000 signalized intersections across the United States alone, each one quietly resolving a tiny negotiation between drivers who will never meet each other dozens of times an hour, every single hour of every single day of the year. Most of us pass through a dozen of them on an average commute without registering a single one individually. That total invisibility was always the entire point of the original design, the same way you never think about a door hinge until the exact day it stops working. So picture the actual moment they all go dark simultaneously, everywhere, without any warning at all. In the first few seconds, almost nobody reacts, because a light was already green or already red for most drivers at that exact instant, and cars simply continue moving as they were already moving a moment earlier. But at the next intersection and the one after that, drivers arrive to find absolutely nothing telling them what to do next. Some slow down out of pure instinct, visibly uncertain. Others, having trusted the light more than their own judgment for years without thinking about it, keep moving at the exact same speed they always have, directly into a space someone else is also entering, from the opposite direction at the same moment. Within the first hour, minor collisions start accumulating in precisely the places you would expect them to appear. Busy four-way intersections downtown, highway on-ramps, anywhere. Traffic volume was already heavy before any of this even started. Not necessarily catastrophic pile-ups, but the smaller, grinding kind of impact that happens whenever two drivers both quietly assume the other one is obviously going to stop first, an assumption that used to be handled by a piece of colored glass and now has to be handled by two strangers guessing correctly at the exact same moment with no time to think it through. Here is something actually worth pausing on for a second, rather than skimming past it entirely. Picture the single most chaotic intersection along your regular daily route, the one you already dread a little every single time you approach it in traffic. Now imagine that same intersection with absolutely no light at all, during evening rush hour, full of drivers who have never once had to negotiate it themselves without help. That mental image, more than any statistic ever could, is probably the clearest way to actually understand what the first real day of this would feel like from inside a moving car. By midday, some drivers start treating every single intersection like an informal four-way stop, slowing almost to a complete crawl, waving each other through with exaggerated nervous caution. That instinct is exactly correct at an individual level, and it is also completely unscalable across an entire city at once. One intersection can survive on polite hesitation between two or three drivers. A city of millions cannot survive on that same hesitation. Multiply it across every junction in a major metro area, and you get something close to total gridlock, not from aggressive driving, but from the opposite problem entirely. Too much uncertainty, repeated constantly, at every single corner in every direction, compounding block by block until entire neighborhoods are simply frozen. Emergency vehicles face an entirely new category of delay almost immediately, and it is the kind that actually matters. An ambulance that used to move through intersections with signals actively clearing a path ahead of it now has to negotiate every single junction like anyone else, sometimes even slower, since uncertain drivers hesitate rather than yield confidently and quickly. A few extra minutes added to a hospital run does not sound dramatic on paper until you remember how often those exact few minutes represent the entire margin a paramedic actually has to work with. In a real emergency, the difference between a call that ends well and one that does not. By the end of the first day, cities start deploying whatever resources they still have on hand. Police officers standing physically in the middle of major intersections, waving traffic through by hand, exactly the way it was done decades ago before automated signals ever existed at all. It genuinely works, at the busiest handful of corners, for as long as an actual officer remains standing there directing cars. It completely fails at the thousands of smaller intersections that no city, anywhere in the world, has enough officers available to cover simultaneously, around the clock, every day, indefinitely, with no reinforcements coming from anywhere. This is roughly where the deeper problem becomes impossible to ignore any longer. A traffic light was never really a piece of hardware bolted to a metal pole. It was coordination itself, manufactured cheaply and distributed everywhere, so that human attention did not have to be spent actively negotiating every single crossing in a city, all day, every day, for an entire lifetime of driving. Remove that coordination and you do not just lose a small convenience. You lose the exact mechanism that let millions of strangers share the same roads without consciously choosing to trust one another every few seconds of every single trip. Take a second here and actually picture yourself at the worst intersection on your daily route, at its busiest hour, with no light, no officer, and no one else slowing down first. Would you be the driver who stops and waves someone through, or the one who assumes it is still their turn? Most people, if they are honest with themselves, are not entirely sure. Tell us your exact answer in the comments below right now so we can discuss it. That small uncertainty, multiplied across millions of drivers doing the same math at the same time, is exactly what a functioning signal used to erase without anyone ever thanking it for the work. Within the first week, some cities try painting temporary stop lines at every major junction, a blunt but genuinely functional substitute for the real thing. It helps, but a stop sign demands that a driver actually stop completely and look both ways. And after decades of following colored lights instead, that older habit does not return instantly for everyone behind the wheel. Rural intersections, largely ignored by this crisis at first, since they carry far less daily traffic overall, start seeing more incidents too, especially anywhere visibility was already poor before any of this ever began. A curve in the road or a line of trees that used to matter far less when a light told everyone exactly when to move. Freight slows first, and it slows the worst of anything. A delivery truck that used to move steadily through a city now stops and negotiates cautiously at every single corner along its route, and multiplied across an entire day's worth of deliveries, that adds real time, real fuel, and real cost that a tight supply chain simply was not budgeted to absorb in the first place. Businesses running on narrow margins feel this within days, not months, and the effect ripples outward into everything those trucks were carrying, from groceries to medical supplies to packages sitting in warehouses waiting for a route that now takes 3 times as long as it used to. Insurance companies move fast, because suddenly every single claim arrives with a genuinely difficult question attached to it. Who actually had the right of way at an intersection with no signal, no stop sign installed yet, and 2 completely conflicting driver accounts of what happened? Courts and claims adjusters face a sudden wave of disputes that used to be settled instantly and silently, by a light simply turning one color instead of another a few seconds earlier. Entire legal categories that assumed a functioning signal now have to be rewritten, sometimes case by case, argument by argument, with no clear precedent to fall back on. Some neighborhoods adapt with real surprising ingenuity during this stretch of time. Residents organize informal volunteer crossing guards at corners near local schools every morning, standing exactly where a signal used to stand, doing by hand what a small box on a pole used to do automatically. Community groups paint temporary priority lines using whatever materials they can find on short notice. Drivers, over a few genuinely exhausting weeks, slowly relearn the older habit of actually making eye contact with another driver before proceeding through a junction, something the light had quietly made unnecessary for most people across their entire driving lives up to that point. The relearning takes real time, and cities in the middle of an active crisis rarely have much of that time to spare. Within a month, most major metro areas have installed some combination of temporary signage, officer-directed intersections during peak commuting hours, and painted priority rules. They are essentially rebuilding a cruder, slower, far more labor-intensive version of the exact automated system that disappeared in the first place, without warning, at enormous cost, using people where a machine used to work quietly for free. Think about the massive economic cost of millions of workers arriving exhausted and frustrated, drained by a morning drive that used to be a passive, automatic experience. The mental toll compounds rapidly, spreading into every workplace. Furthermore, The sheer physical infrastructure required to permanently replace the missing automated signals would take incredible financial resources, bankrupting many smaller municipalities who already struggle with their basic daily budgets. They would be forced to permanently raise local taxes or aggressively cut other vital public services like community parks and public libraries, just to afford enough traffic officers and painted signs to keep the roads barely functional. This invisible tax on time and money perfectly illustrates the absolute necessity of the system we suddenly lost. It powerfully reminds us that modern civilization relies deeply on these silent, tireless machines. Without them, our rapid mobility collapses into slow, anxious crawling. We are completely dependent on these hidden agreements. We absolutely need them to survive the modern world. This vulnerability is something most city planners actively worry about behind closed doors, though they rarely admit it to the general public during normal times. The fragility is very real. The danger is truly constant. It is always there, waiting just beneath the surface of our daily routines. Every single time you safely cross an intersection, you are participating in an unspoken social contract that miraculously holds our entire complex society together. When that contract breaks, everything else stops moving too. There are a few unexpected upsides tucked inside all this disruption, worth naming honestly rather than glossing over. Slower intersections, out of sheer necessity, mean lower average vehicle speeds across dense areas. And lower speeds generally mean fewer serious injuries, even as minor fender benders tick upward overall. Some cities discover, almost by accident, that certain intersections never actually needed a full automated signal to begin with, and could remain simple, stop-controlled crossings permanently, long after the original crisis has fully passed and been forgotten by almost everyone who lived through it. Filed away is one more strange chapter in the city's history. But nobody stuck for 40 minutes negotiating a single four-way crossing during evening rush hour would call any of that comforting in the actual moment they are living through it, behind the wheel. The real cost of relearning basic trust between total strangers at the scale of an entire city ends up measured in traffic jams and fender benders that stretch on for months rather than days or weeks, and in a quiet, low-grade anxiety that used to belong only to unfamiliar cities and now belongs to every single commute. No matter how familiar the route once felt, you are back at that same intersection eventually, and there is a working light hanging above it again, quietly running its familiar forgettable sequence exactly like before any of this happened. Nothing about the physical road itself ever actually changed throughout any part of this ordeal. What disappeared for a while was the one small thing that used to let you stop looking every single driver directly in the eye and just trust a colored light instead, without ever thinking twice about it. A traffic light was never really about controlling cars on a road. It was thousands of tiny, invisible agreements between total strangers, quietly renewed every few seconds without anyone noticing, so that none of you ever had to negotiate any of it for yourselves.